President Trump ordered a drone strike this week that killed Iran's leading general, Qassim Suleimani, in Baghdad, Iraq. That decision came days after pro-Iranian protesters attacked the U.S. embassy there. And on Friday, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said this.
There was, in fact, an imminent attack taking place. The American people should know that this was an intelligence-based assessment that drove this.
Democratic leaders, however, are concerned about the president's handling of the strike. A senior aide to House Speaker Nancy Pelosi told me this morning that she got no advance notification, but did speak later to Defense Secretary Mark Esper. Republicans remain united. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell said this.
I recommend that all senators wait to review the facts and hear from the administration before passing much public judgment on this operation and its potential consequences.
Joining us tonight to discuss this crisis moment in foreign policy as the 2020 election countdown begins, Lisa Desjardins, congressional correspondent for the PBS NewsHour, Toluse Olorunnipa, White House reporter for The Washington Post, Susan Page, Washington bureau chief for USA Today, Michael Crowley, White House reporter for the New York Times, just back from Mar-a-Lago with President Trump, and Nancy Youssef, national security correspondent for the Wall Street Journal, joining us from Capitol Hill. As Michael and his colleagues wrote on the front page of today's New York Times, quote, General Soleimani was the architect of nearly every significant operation by Iranian intelligence and military forces over the past decade, and his death was a staggering blow for Iran at a time of sweeping geopolitical conflict. The strike was also a serious escalation of Mr. Trump's growing confrontation with Tehran. Michael, thanks so much for being here. I know you needed a little coffee back from Florida, now on our set. Take us inside the decision in terms of the intelligence. We saw from Secretary of State Mike Pompeo that there was intelligence that led to this. What do we know about that intelligence?
Well, this is a critical question, and part of the problem here for people who want to know what happened and for Democrats on Capitol Hill who are very frustrated right now is that we don't have a lot of details. Now, the administration did not brief virtually any members of Congress about this operation before it happened. There was no congressional buy-in. I say virtually any because Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina, who's a friend of the president's, was down golfing with him and apparently was looped into this. And people don't know exactly what the basis for this extraordinary act of aggression against Iran, this essentially provocation that the Iranians will see as an act of war, why was this a catalyst for the United States to take this action? What administration officials are saying is that Soleimani was planning specific new attacks that had the potential to lead to the deaths of hundreds of Americans in the Middle East, military members and diplomats. But we're not getting more details than that. And there is a lot of skepticism on Capitol Hill. Number one, there's the history of intelligence being cooked up in the example of the Iraq War with weapons of mass destruction. And number two, let's be frank about this. The Trump administration has squandered a lot of its credibility through 1,000 small falsehoods over the past several years. And so there is real doubt that Soleimani was doing something much different than he has been doing for many years, menacing Americans and others in the region.
Nancy, you've been at the Pentagon all day talking to top U.S. officials. Can you add, based on your reporting, any new details to what Michael just said in terms of the intelligence, in terms of the rationale?
So one of the things that they said at the Pentagon today was that Qassim Suleimani had been traveling from Damascus to Beirut and to Baghdad, where he was struck, as part of this plot, that this was a targeted campaign, multifaceted, that extended across Syria, potentially to troops in northeast Syria, to Lebanon, potentially diplomatic quarters there, and then to Iraq. And they have said that this was something that was imminent, potentially within days. But as Michael said, they haven't offered more specifics than that. And I think one reason people have a lot of questions is that Qassim Soleimani has posed a threat to U.S. interests and troops for, some would argue, decades. And one could argue that the threat that he posed through his paramilitary and militia troops in countries like Lebanon and Syria and Iraq had continued and was not markedly different. And so what the Pentagon sought to say was that this time this threat had to be acted upon quickly and through the strike campaign.
Nancy, how will Iran respond based on your conversations with U.S. officials?
Well, what's interesting is you sensed within the Pentagon an anxiety about what the response could be, because in a way there were endless possibilities. Qassim Suleimani controlled dozens of paramilitary and militia groups throughout the region where U.S. troops are based. And so, and this is speculation, but these are some of the possible responses. You could see attacks on allies in the region. You could see attacks on U.S. interests in the region. You could see an uptick in terms of how these militia react. I should point out that the other challenge is that Iran doesn't necessarily control the response, because some of these groups potentially could act out on their own in response to their own anger about Qassim Soleimani's death. That is, you could see a group, say in Lebanon, begin to target Israel or something like that, not because they've been ordered by Iran, but they've chosen to act out on their own to express their frustration by U.S. actions.
Michael, just following up on that, what would an escalation look like? The U.S. is now sending thousands of more troops to the region. Would it be boots on the ground? Would it be cyber warfare? What have you heard inside this administration about what war or a conflict would look like?
Well, I think one thing we've heard is an apprehension within the administration which says we don't know what's coming next. There are a lot of different things the Iranians can do, and trying to prepare for all of them is not easy. And in particular, I think there is a real concern about Iran's cyber capabilities. You know, viewers, look, today, anecdotally, I had a lot of friends and relatives sending me text messages. Should I be afraid? A friend in New York City was going to take his family to see The Lion King in Times Square, and he said, I don't want to go to Times Square on Sunday. You know, I'm worried about this. And my response to people like that is that I think that the threat of something blowing up in Times Square seems low, but the way this could affect ordinary Americans.
Is that what U.S. officials are saying? That there's a lower, not too much of a threat of an attack here in the U.S.?
Well, let me phrase it this way. What U.S. officials are saying is that Iran has very good cyber capabilities in a way many Americans may not appreciate, and the threat of attacks on American critical infrastructure, for instance, computer systems, banking systems, corrupting data, spreading viruses, that is a very plausible scenario. That's the thing that I think the average American could worry about. Then you have this whole bucket, and Nancy touched on this, threats in the region, diplomats, U.S. troops. We have a small contingent still in Syria. They do not have a lot of force protection, and that would be the more traditional way the Iranians could hit us, or allies like Israel or Saudi Arabia.
Nancy, stay with us. I want to pull back, bring in the whole table here, because President Trump made such a critical decision for his presidency. Here's what he had to say today about that decision.
Soleimani has been perpetrating acts of terror to destabilize the Middle East for the last 20 years. What the United States did yesterday should have been done long ago. We do not seek regime change. However, the Iranian regime's aggression in the region, including the use of proxy fighters to destabilize its neighbors, must end, and it must end now.
Toluse, you and I have been working together all day for the Washington Post trying to figure out why this happened. Based on your conversations with your sources, was it the hawks? Were the hawks perched on the president's shoulder, the generals in this administration urging action? Were Republicans pressuring him? Why did he do this?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and the fact that the president doesn't seem to have sort of a core foreign policy means that sometimes when people get in the room with him, they can convince him one way or the other. The president is battling dual impulses. He's, in some senses, an isolationist. He says, America first, I don't want to be involved in these quagmires in the Middle East, but he also wants to be a tough guy. He wants to project strength and say, if any of these countries, if any of these leaders threaten anyone in the U.S., threaten Americans abroad, then I'm going to go after them with fire and fury. And I think he's battling those two impulses. The fact that the Iranians had stormed into the embassy in Iraq, the president saw that as an affront to his presidency and wanted to take strong actions. And the fact that, according to the intelligence that he'd been briefed on, he saw that there was what he called an imminent threat to Americans in the region, and for that reason he took this drastic step. But let it be very clear that he is still apprehensive about this idea that he's sending more troops into the Middle East. He's going back on some of his promises of the campaign trail that he's going to get Americans out of the Middle East, and actually having to do something that's opposite of that. I think he's concerned about that.
So apprehension, but also taking action. Susan, is there a Trump doctrine?
I think if you would have said 24 hours ago what the Trump doctrine was, it would have been end endless wars. What did he campaign on in 2016? Let's get out of Afghanistan. Let's get out of Iraq. And yet now with this action, he has guaranteed an Iranian retaliation, a war of some sort, maybe not a traditional-looking war, maybe something more like Michael was talking about. And you know, there are no defenders in the United States of General Soleimani. There's no one saying he was a good guy, he didn't deserve to die this way. There is concern that President Trump has not thought through the consequences of what's going to happen next. This is something that is going to some degree, shape and define the rest of his presidency, dealing with the consequences of the action that was taken last night.